I'm delighted to welcome Anasuya Sengupta, who is our keynote speaker for today. Anasuya is the co-director and co-founder of Whose Knowledge. She's led initiatives in India and the USA across the Global South and internationally for over 20 years to amplify marginalized voices in virtual and physical worlds. She's the former Chief Grant-Making Officer at the Wikimedia Foundation, a former Regional Program Director at the Global Fund for Women, and a 2017 Shuttleworth Foundation Fellow. She received a 2018 Internet and Society Award from the Oxford Internet Institute and is on the Scholars Council for UCLA's Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. Anasuya holds an MPhil in Development Studies from the University of Oxford, where she studied as a Rhodes Scholar. She also has a BA in Economics from Delhi University. This is my favorite bit. When not rabble-rousing online, Anasuya builds and breaks pots and poems, takes long walks by the water and in the forest, and contorts herself into yoga poses. Anasuya, I'm delighted to welcome you.
Thank you so much, Laura, and it's lovely to be here. I'm now going to test the limits of technology and try and share my screen. Let's see if this works. And there we go. Excellent. It is wonderful to be here with you. I am Anasuya Sengupta, and I come to you from a feminist collective global campaign called Whose Knowledge. You can see two of my compañeras, Adele Brana and Siko Bouters, in our happy picture over here. I also come to you through a journey which includes being in the humanitarian sector and now, of course, in spaces of technology as a feminist and social justice activist from India, who now lives in London via the United States. I span many diasporas of many different domains, but it's therefore a particular delight and honor for me to be here with all of you in the CDAC community, because it feels like many different parts of myself coming together. For many years while I was based in India, headed a UNICEF project, and of course, being from India, being middle class, and being Savarna, or from the upper caste, I have embodied many different systems of power and privilege, or dispower and disprivilege, including through environmental and political crises, of which all of you know much more than I do. So for me, I just want to say, as I talk through or share my reflections today, I'm doing so with tough love. I'm doing so because I have been in these worlds. I am in these worlds. I love the possibilities of technology. I want our world to be a better place, like all of us do. And we need to ask ourselves and each other tough questions in order to create and support an equitable, joyful, just world. So moving along, what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about what it means to decolonize the internet, including algorithms. I'm going to talk, unsurprisingly, about power, equity, and decolonization, just to remind us of what these concepts mean in practice, and come back to what does this mean for all of us in the humanitarian sector. So let's start with who is online. It might surprise you to know that over 60% of the world is now online. Of course, we are online in many different ways and many different on many different devices through very differential access. Some of us much more easily than others, but 60% of the world is now online. 40% of the world is still not. And of those who are online, 75%, 3/4 of those who are online are from the Global South, from Asia and the Pacific Islands, from Latin America, Africa and the Caribbean, and all the many worlds that many of you serve and support. Of all women, nearly 50%, nearly half of all women are online. So who builds these infrastructures that we talk of when talking about being online, including, of course, algorithms. Only 5% of leadership positions in the technology sector are held by women. In the USA, women hold only 25% of computing positions. Only 5% of those are Asian women. Only 3% of those are Black. And as you can see, this continues for Hispanic folks as well. Only 6% of technical workers at Apple are Black. In fact, oops, have I just shifted my screen? No, there we are. In fact, in 2016, when they looked at 10 of the largest Silicon Valley companies, technology companies, they found not a single Black woman was employed. That was 2016. So let's go on to, once you're on the internet, what do you see? Whose knowledge is online? So our frenemies at Google did an estimate a few years ago looking at how many books have ever been published. And they found, generally speaking, there are about 130 million books that have ever been published in about 480 languages. There's an exception, which I will come to in a second. There are over 7,000 languages in the world. So quick back of the envelope calculation, only about 7% of the world's knowledge, because language is a proxy for knowledge, is in books. The most translated book in the world, the Bible, nearly 3,000 languages. The most translated document in the world, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with over 350 languages. I want to pause here and just sort of look at this really interesting issue that most of the most translated content in the world, whether in books or in documents, is the Bible and the UNDHR. And both of those, to most of the communities that they come to and are read by, are not produced by those communities, have not really been produced in consultation with those communities. And whatever you think about the content of the Bible or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they are not necessarily specific to the context of the communities that read them or learn about them. And it's a thought to hold. So, whose knowledge is online then? Most of the online content of the world is in English. Nearly 60% of all websites are in English. Russian is a very, very lagging second. Most users who come online in English and then in Chinese. Most digital scholarly publications that include publications about humanitarian aid or technology are in English. 80% of all scientific journals and 90% of all social science journals that are indexed on Scopus and JSTOR are in English. The internet does not sound, look, read like most of us in the world. Even more importantly, the design, the architecture, the content, the governance, the overall power of the internet does not reside with most of us in the world. So we, the marginalized majority, what do we do about it? We want to decolonize the internet. But we can't talk about decolonization in any sector or sphere of the world without talking about power. And I know these are conversations and questions that are very familiar to all of you listening and to all of you in the sector. But I want to remind us, because we use the word power sometimes very easily, what does it actually mean in practice? What are the questions that we have to hold, not at the back of our minds, but at the front of our minds? What does it mean to move from an individual prejudice to systemic structural power. Who does what? Who gets what? Who sets the agenda? Who decides what? And more importantly, whose story is it that we're telling ourselves? What is that story? Who is the storyteller? Whose data are we talking about? Who built the algorithm? Who is the product? At this moment in time, looking at data and big data, we are the product. We are not actually consumers. We are the product. So who is the analyst and engineer of us? What is the power behind the algorithm? Whose experience, whose design, whose leadership? As we know about algorithms, and all of you know well, algorithms can have bias in multiple ways. Two of the most important ones being that you can have bad data sets, but data sets themselves are embedded in power, right? What do we know of Black women? What do we know of brown men? What do we know of Pacific Islanders? But the answer is not to make better data sets that someone else controls. Who designs the algorithms that help us analyze this data? It's not a black box when you begin. It becomes a black box once the patterns of math continue, but someone has designed the math. Cathy O'Neil, who I think has written an extraordinary book about algorithms with probably one of the best titles in the world, Weapons of Math Destruction, talks about it as algorithms are opinions embedded in code. And I'd like to go further. They're not just opinions. They're opinions of power embedded in code. So if we want to also ask ourselves about our own sector, the humanitarian sector, we could say humanitarian protocols. We could talk about humanitarian protocols and say humanitarian systems are not just opinions embedded in protocol. They're systems of power embedded in protocol. That brings us to decolonization. That's an image from The Guardian. I found it by The Guardian. I just ask you to hold it in your head and your heart and your body for a minute. What is decolonization to me? At whose knowledge? This is the definition we often talk about. We call it the personal and systemic unpacking and dismantling of historical structures of power and privilege that govern the ways we live our lives today. Who we are, how we think, what we get, what we do, how we do. Most importantly, who is the expert, who designs, and who leads. So decolonization is about analyzing, understanding, and accepting these histories of relations between and the hierarchies of power over people, resources, institutions, non-human life, the earth, what we otherwise call colonization, capitalism, patriarchy, racism, homophobia, and many other isms and forms of discrimination, and then changing these inequitable relations into more equitable and holistic ones. It is uncomfortable. It does have to hurt. It doesn't have to hurt, to the point that it makes us wounded and guilt-ridden. It has to hurt to the point of responsibility, of taking responsibility for these historical structures and relationships. It is messy, it's unsettling, it's always a work in progress and a work in process. And it is not only about individuals. It is not only a metaphor. So we are all using decolonizing very easily these days as a word. We use it as well, as you can see. But for us, it's not just the metaphor. The metaphor helps us enter the conversation, but the conversation has to shift in practice. It has to transform structures and processes of power. It is not about efficiency. It's about equity. And equity might lead to effectiveness. In fact, we think it does. But the starting point has to be equity and power. So I want to take a minute, just maybe 30 seconds given the time, for you to look at this very familiar picture of that defines equity. I dislike this picture intensely. I want you to think about why I might dislike it. Just think about that for now 5 seconds. All right, I'm going to tell you why I dislike it. I dislike it because it doesn't show the actual embedded structures of power and privilege. It looks like it's a level playing field, literally. And the infant, because of course, those we want to support through equitable practices, has to be infantilized, just needs those 2 boxes in order to see. This is a much more true version of equity. Not just are we all humans together, deserving of the same dignity, but many of us humans can't see far enough because the fence is higher for us and the playing field is much, much lower. So very quickly, in terms of colonization and resources, because this is important for us as we think about aid, and I will say I dislike the word aid, but of course I've used it because we all use it in this sector. There's a very strong argument that is made that my colonial master, the British, and yes, there's an irony that I'm sitting in London as I say this, our colonial masters developed India. Oh, and they developed India in so many different ways. They gave us trains, they gave us education, it was good for us in so many ways. That is language we use to this day in many different parts of our lives. What did actually happen, which a wonderful feminist economist Utsa Patnaik found in 2018, she analyzed how much money had been siphoned out of India over 200 years, $45 trillion. In 2018, Britain's GDP was approximately 3 trillion. So Britain did not develop India. India developed Britain. Wakanda, for those of you who are fans of Black Panther, as I am, is not an Afro future. It is a possible Afro past. If this is what happened to India, imagine what colonization did and continues to do to all of us who have been colonized. So what does aid and the humanitarian sector really do? And again, remember, I ask these questions out of tough love. I ask these questions of myself as I do of you. So let's look at some of the things that decolonizing aid and algorithms might look like. It is not your money. It is not my money. This is reparations. The work we do is not charity. It is reparative. You are not the expert. Experience is the expert. PhDs don't matter when you're talking about the expertise needed to truly understand the socio-political, technical systems that are our communities. You are not the designer. So how do you center, not control, the communities that you are trying to support and serve? You are not the leader. So how can you serve and not see yourself as a savior? Most importantly, those of us who caused the problem cannot imagine or lead the solution. We can support it. We certainly must serve it, but we cannot lead it. Audre Lorde said, as she said so many brilliant things, if I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive. Most importantly, in all that we talk about with decolonization is imagination. What would Ancestor Lorde be saying to us if we asked her to imagine what an equitable, feminist, decolonized internet might look like, or an equitable, feminist, decolonized algorithm or aid. I'm going to end with reminding us that no one is free until we are all free. So decolonization liberates us all. I know you probably are all sitting with a little fear and pain in the pit of your stomach. I always do when I talk about this, but I remind myself that this will make us all more joyful. Revolution is a symphony of liberations. And what it takes, as my extraordinary feminist inspiration from South Africa, Pregs Govinder, says, it takes love, it takes courage, it takes insubordination. So let's decolonize ourselves, our work, and the robots that are coming. Thank you all.